In my late teens, I had this friend called Felix. Unlike my social anxiety-ridden self, he was a social butterfly and appeared to know everyone. As such, I ended up knowing a lot of people by proxy and hung out with some interesting folk. The one I'm going to be talking about is called Carly. I was at Felix's place one night with a few people, and we were all playing a game of Risk. We'd smoked a bit and got to talking about some weird topics, compounded by the fact that we were all strange teens. You know, the usual. My buddy had crazy stories about getting struck at a radio tower. Another friend had stories about getting locked in a basement all night. I had my ghost stories, and it was one of the few times people believed me, so that was nice. Carly had the one we called bullshit on the most. She was your typical edgy goth girl, complete with clothes that would put a stripper to shame and enough makeup that it had noticeable thickness. She was hot, I admit that, but we were distant friends, and I'd only hung out with her a few times with Felix. She seemed nice though, if a bit emotionally reserved. Well, this night, she up and states that she's an energy vampire. I had no idea what that was, and as I didn't really have access to a lot of internet in rural Newfoundland, she goes on to say that she gets energy from people's emotions, she can feel people's auras, and she detects when people have issues, and she has to keep her emotions in check because she can get powerful. Me and Felix obviously call bull, as we had never seen her be powerful, and those claims reek of fake, coming from some edgy goth kid. She goes on and does a reading, where she's able to tell me about my emotions. I remember she rightly said I was depressed, but that isn't much of a shocker to anyone who'd met me, and told Felix he had a grave impending injury. His mum did have a stroke about a year later, for what little that might be worth, but she also said some other vague things to the rest of the people we were hanging out with, which were probably correct, but I don't know. Finally, after this had gone on for an hour or so, I called her bluff. I asked her where she got her mystical powers. I remember asking if her dad was a warlock and her mum a pixie. She says she was taught by Mother Hilda. That was the most bull name I've ever heard, I said. Where the hell does she live? Up your ass. Becoming visibly distressed, she said to me and Felix, who were laughing, that she could bring me to meet her next weekend. Thinking she would bring me to one of her weird goth friends who would try to do some edgy stuff, I was always down for a laugh and said yes. Felix was down as well, so it was settled. Now it's important to know that I have an issue with being a passenger in cars. I fall asleep almost immediately while not driving. If I'm lucky, I can make it 5 minutes, and that's a miracle. It's really important to remember this, because I sure as hell wish it wasn't the case. So when the weekend comes, me and Felix and Carly all get together to go meet this person. I had assumed it would be some person that we would meet in the basement of her parents' house, but Carly says that Mother Hilda lives on the Bonavista Peninsula. That's a good 3 hours drive away in good weather from where we are. So I was frankly more angry that she didn't bring snacks. So we all got in the car. She had gotten her license already since she was 6 months older than us, and we set off. In my true fashion, I fell asleep within minutes, and I don't think we even hit the highway before I was out. When I had woken up, we were driving on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. For those of you who haven't been to Newfoundland, I think my wife put the Bonavista Peninsula best. It's like you're walking on the graves of a million really pissed off ghosts. Gloomy skies, gloomy landscapes, and a real feeling that someone is watching you from the tree line where you can't see them. I frankly hate that place. Most people I know from it are great, but everyone who I know who lives on it is miserable. So I come to, and we're driving down this poor excuse for a road, and what could be more aptly named a goat path. So I immediately start complaining. Where the hell are we? Why are we here? What are you planning? You know, reasonable questions. To all these questions, she just answered, Mother Hilda will answer. In the tone of a psychopath. Felix doesn't say a word and just looks mildly amused. So after what felt like forever, we come to a clearing. It is really just a place where the trees aren't that big. In the middle sat an old-school Newfoundland box house in absolutely horrible condition. Like no one had shown this house a lick of love in over 100 years kind of rundown. It still had windows, but the roof looked like it was attempting to threaten the ground with its lean. I remember the place was blue, and the goat path didn't reach all the way up to it. It stopped 100 feet shy. Carly stopped the car, gets out, and like a psycho says again, Mother Hilda will answer. I look to Felix, who has the biggest grin on his face. He's high as a kite. I berate him, as this is horrifying, and his only real response getting out of the car is, You're a better man for me than doing this sober. So I get out of the car with Felix, who insists that I go first. My only thought is that I am going to meet the end. Carly walks through the trees with her arms outstretched in a T-pose, spinning and singing, Mother Hilda knows all. Felix looks at me and says, We're getting ended, aren't we? Carly reaches the door, opens it up, and motions for us to come in. Now I saw two options. Either go in with the witchy woman or brave the untamed wilderness of rural Newfoundland in who knows where. I decide the latter, as that one only has a chance that I don't perish and no one finds the body. I reach the door and the place is pitch black inside. It was a generally overcast day outside, and the windows must have been covered in paper or something. Not freaking furnished. No lighting, just rotting boards and the smell of my impending doom. I can hear Carly laughing upstairs, because of course there's an upstairs. So I think, yep, this is where I meet my maker. This is a house where she does her weird rituals, and I can tell Felix is thinking the same thing, but he insists I go first. Thankfully, the stairs were next to the door in the front of the house, so I didn't have to risk walking through that creepy place. When I look up the stairs, I nearly wet myself. At the top is a girl naked and pointing down the upstairs hallway. She has makeup like Carly, thick and dark, and is staring at us with intent, evil eyes. I turn to look at Felix when the girl at the top of the stairs belts out, in a voice louder than I'd peg her to have, Mother Hilda doesn't wait. I was so petrified. I walk up those stairs and the place was eerie silent. I hadn't really noticed it before, but there was no sound of the wind in the trees, no birds chirping, no rustling, and no floorboards creaking. I started to get those really nasty vibes. Felix flashed me a hunting knife he brought along with him and whispered, I got you. We're leaving alive. Feeling 0.1% better, I reached the top of the stairs. The girl, who was maybe 14, ran into a room on the upper floor, and I saw Carly at the end of the hall next to a door, what I assumed to be a closet. She had the biggest grin on her face, like a proud child about to show their mum a Play-Doh figure they had worked on all day. I walked closer, and with all the manly gusto I had in me, made it 5 steps in the hallway. I had the feeling that I was going to puke. and every fibre in my being was telling me whatever was behind that door was danger, pure danger. Carly looked at me and said, "Mother Hilda will see you now," and opened the door. What was inside was what I believed to be a small child. Its back turned to me and was eating something in the closet. I remember seeing chicken bones at its feet, which were huge. It was wearing a ratty red shawl and was arse naked below the waist. And that's when I noticed it was an old person. It had that typical saggy old person arse, the one that lacks all tone and definition. I was watching this thing turn around, and it was the scariest sight of my life. It was some kind of old woman, but I questioned that frequently given its appearance. It had tiny, tiny arms, like an infant on a toddler's body, that was holding her shawl up. It had wispy angelic strands barely holding onto its head, and a noticeable hump on its back. I assumed I noticed this because its face didn't make sense. It was teeth, just one big mouth with hundreds of misshapen teeth. The entire face looked like it had been scooped out and just given teeth, rows upon rows. I saw no eyes, no nose, no forehead, just long, creepy teeth. It snarled and yelled, "No men!" I passed out. When I woke up, I was back in Felix's house, him already up and staring at the floor with a 1,000-yard stare. I asked him if I had some kind of weird dream, and without missing a beat he says, "Mother Hilda is real, man." I thought it was a creepy fake thing, but I saw it too. We spoke for about 30 minutes about what happened, and we'd basically had the same recollection of events, except Felix saw her move a step or two closer before he blacked out. I said I should go home. He said I should leave, and we both went our separate ways. Over the next few days, I'd tried to message Carly back in the days of MSN, but the only response I ever got was, "Mother Hilda never forgets." After 3 days of this, about 10 messages a day, I say to Carly, I don't need that in my life, and I never hung out with her again. Although I did see her from time to time in school, but she refused to look at me. I had only one more encounter with Mother Hilda, or whatever the hell she is. I had quite a big yard before the river, and had a sizable fire pit where I would have fires. Having Felix as my only real friend, I had many bonfires alone. That was fine. I enjoyed the spectacle of it all. So one night I was having a fire, and started to get really into it. Flames were perhaps 15 feet high, and I was having a great time. I'd whipped off my shirt, placed it by the 6-foot poking stick, and had begun chanting in gibberish. I don't know why, but it was a conscious action. Teenagers are weird. On the other side of the fire, through a line of trees, was a smaller path my neighbour had to go to the woods. I catch a glance out of the corner of my eye. There's something small in the trees. Thinking it could be a wildcat or perhaps a baby bear, I stop to look at it. From the other side of the line, I see Mother Hilda, her gaping maw wide open and facing my direction. I go to scream, as is a logical action, but Mother Hilda yells, "No!" and my raging inferno goes out. Not even an ember stayed lit. Cold, dead fire. I looked back. No Mother Hilda. I decided that was enough of that. I booked it to my house as fast as my legs could carry. When I get inside, my mum asks me why I'm not having the fire anymore. She rarely cared what I did, so I asked why she wanted to know. My mum said that the nice girl who wears black asked me about it maybe 5 minutes ago at the front door. Mum had told her I was having a fire, and she started to walk to the backyard. I go to my room, horrified, and message Carly on MSN to demand what the hell. I shouldn't have gotten an answer, since she had just been at my door, but I did. Mother Hilda likes you. I haven't really told anyone this story before now, as it's one of the more outlandish ones, but my friend Felix still won't talk about it. I met him a while ago when I travelled back to Newfoundland, and asked him if he remembered Carly in the creepy house. He just looked at me and said with dead eyes, "Mother Hilda is real, man. Don't mess about," and walked away. I still have yet to make sense of it, like a lot of things that have happened to me. A little background information about me. I have panic disorder. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a mental illness that causes extreme anxiety, severe panic attacks, and a slew of problems. I've been suffering with this for over a year now, and while it's getting better, it is still very difficult to deal with. Please keep this in mind. My husband and I have been married a little over a year now. The time we were married, unfortunately, I was undergoing medical issues that no doctors could seem to explain. I was having panic attacks all the time, and they would be so severe, I would have to be taken to the ER, where they would have to literally sedate me to calm me down. I was also losing weight at an exponential and scary rate, becoming sicker and sicker as time went on. Not even a month after we were married, I lost my job and was homebound while my husband worked second shift, which was 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. He would arrive home at around 4 a.m., leaving me alone most of the time. My parents and younger brother live close by, perhaps a 10-minute drive at most. But at the moment, my mother, who is a schoolteacher, and father, who works in a factory, were unable to watch over me. They called me as frequently as they could, but that was all they could do. In May, I was told by doctors that I was literally at death's door, and unless something happened quickly, my family was going to lose me. I was given medication to help with the panic attacks and to get me to eat. They wanted to hospitalize me, but I refused. My parents decided that when they and my younger brother went to Florida the next month, they were taking me with them. Again, keep in mind, I am both anxious and extremely sick. Around this time, the real issue begins. Not with me, but with our neighbors. See, we've never actually met our neighbors personally. My husband lived in the trailer for a month on his own before we married, and he always said they were odd, but they didn't seem to be of any concern. However, once I came into the picture, that changed. The person who lived in the trailer before us was actually a cousin of mine, who rented from another cousin and his wife who lived states away. Nora was a huge druggie and a drug dealer, so people got used to getting their fixes and drugs at the trailer we now live in. Then a few months before we moved in, she got in trouble with the law and landed in jail for some time. I'm guessing our neighbors who, according to our landlords, were drug addicts and raging alcoholics as well, and they thought that perhaps she was back. I'm not quite sure. I suppose this is because from where I was so sick, and my husband slept when he could from both working odd hours and taking care of me, so they never actually saw us. They just knew that someone was there. They became active at night. During the day, they were predominantly quiet. Every once in a while, they would do something outside, but for the most part, nothing really happened. It was always after my husband left for work. My car was still there, which should have told them at least someone was still home. It started off innocently enough, driving up and down in front of the house, parking in the road directly in front of it, and waiting. They'd honk the horn, but I ignored them. Several times I called my parents, asking them what to do. They said for me to just ignore them, because maybe they thought Nora was back, and after some time they'd get the hint it was new people and leave me be. So I did just that, for a time. When they started driving up the driveway and stopping at the porch, that is the first time that I called the cops. All I was told was as long as they didn't encroach on my actual property, there was nothing they could do. They advised me to turn on the lights to my house, signaling I was home. I couldn't sleep, despite needing to. I had mono and panic disorders and depression, and I desperately needed to sleep. My husband had the weekends off, and you can guess it, there were never any issues then. It was insane and infuriating. Everyone believed me when I said I was having problems, but there was only so much I could do. My father-in-law brought over one of his shotguns, a 12 gauge, knowing that I was a good shot. He told me to use it if I needed to. Another background thing is that I shot trap for years, and when I was 18, I placed second in district. I chose not to go to state, but knowing I was good enough for second was a proud moment for me. My father-in-law made me promise I would use it if it came to it, so I did. One night, my husband was at work, and I guess my body finally shut off. I fell asleep for once, only to be awoken at 1 a.m. to the sound of our neighbor's truck tearing out from behind the trailer. I jumped up and looked outside to see them driving out of our driveway. They started speeding up in front of the house, and I called the cops again. I called my dad, my mum, and my dad came over because I was in full panic attack mode. My dad called my husband, who came immediately. There were tire marks in the grass behind the trailer, but they couldn't necessarily prove it was them, despite me describing their truck down to the dents. My dad told the cops this had been going on long enough, but again, there was not enough evidence nor proof. A week, just one more week until I could go with my family to Florida. I somehow managed to be a bridesmaid in my older brother's wedding, despite being so sick. I was doped up on medication to keep me calm, so that I wouldn't have another panic attack. And to be honest, I don't recall much about that day other than it poured with rain. My husband, naturally, was at work. I was sitting at home, our 2 cats soundly asleep, and I was playing my 3DS, with Markiplier on the TV for background. The time around midnight, my cats suddenly awoke and came unglued. They ran to the side door, then to the front door, growling and hissing, their hair on end. They'd never behaved that way before, so I started to get up to see what it was they were freaking out about. When I hear it, "How are we gonna do this?" I froze. I heard them. I heard their footsteps as they walked up and down the front porch. I wasn't sure how many there were, but I knew for a fact there were at least 3 men outside. My curtains were closed, and most of the lights were off, but the TV was on, and surely they could hear Markiplier's eccentric volume. They had gotten quieter. I heard their footsteps on the porch again. I grabbed my phone, shakily swiping it until I found my dad's number and calling him. I remember breathing hard, feeling a panic attack setting in. "Hello?" They're here," I remember sobbing. "They're on the porch, Daddy. They want to get in." "I'm on my way. Call the cops." I hung up with him, then heard them talking amongst themselves on how they wanted to break in and what they wanted. I ran into the bedroom, grabbed the 12 gauge, opened the chamber to see it fully loaded and called the cops. I left the lights off. I decided I was going to have them caught this time, and I wasn't going to run off. The dispatch answered, and I told them what was going on. As sick as I was, I managed to hold that shotgun to my shoulder, pointed at the door, remembering everything my dad taught me about shooting while I was a hunter, and when I shot trap. But I was still scared out of my mind. Somehow I kept my panic attack down, but I was still breathing hard. "Calm your breath, son. You say they're outside?" "Yes. I heard one say they heard me. Then the other one said it wouldn't be a problem." "Oh my God." "They're coming, sweetie, I promise." "I'm armed." "Excuse me?" "I'm armed." I said it, hoping that they'd hear me. "With what, sweetheart?" 12 gauge. They want to hurt me. I'm not going to let them." "She's armed," I heard him tell the police, who were supposed to be on their way. I heard "armed" from one of the guys outside, then silence. "Ma'am?" "I can't." I heard the footsteps, leaving, then saw the lights to my dad's truck. "My dad's here." I lowered the shotgun and ran outside, my dad and younger brother running out of the truck. My dad had the Judge in hand, which is a pistol that shoots 12 gauge rounds and feels like a hand cannon. You'd swear you'd just broken your wrist. While my younger brother was holding a knife. "It's my dad and brother. They're armed too." "Okay, what of the men?" "I don't see 'em." "When the cops get there, disarm yourselves, okay?" I thanked the dispatchers for everything, and about this time the cops pulled up. I told my dad and younger brother to disarm, so they put the weapons in the truck while I took my gun inside and sat in the kitchen on top of our dinner table. My dad told me to get back in the house and for my younger brother to go with me. As soon as I stepped inside, the panic attack hit. My dad came inside for a moment and hugged me, telling me how brave I had been, especially for holding it as long as I did. Shaking, crying, gasping for breath, I listened as he went back outside. The cops found footprints and an area on the porch where the men had tried to break in at one point, but the men had scattered, leaving it difficult for the cops to trace exactly where they came from. My dad told them it was the neighbors, and my landlord actually called and told the cops it was more likely our neighbors as well, who had apparently been giving my cousin who lives up the road a difficult time too. The cops noticed some of the footprints went into the neighbor's yard, but they weren't home, of course. I remember my dad and younger brother standing outside, just as the cops pulled up, yelling as loudly as they could that they would drop them if they ever so much as saw them around me again. "Enough is enough," my dad yelled over and over. "She's sick. She needs rest. Leave her the hell alone or I'll drop you, I swear." And I noticed he was crying. My dad isn't the type of person to do that. My whole life, I've seen my dad cry maybe a handful of times. When he talked about his deceased father, when my grandma died, when the doctors told me I was on death's door, when my younger brother was born, with 10 years difference between us. My dad had been scared that he wouldn't get there in time, and maybe, just maybe, I would hesitate to protect myself. But I had made my mind up. I wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. That night, my husband came home from work and hugged me so tightly, I thought my lungs would burst. My younger brother texted him what was going on, but reassured him I was okay. A week later, I went to Florida. Time went on, and I'm still getting better. As for my neighbors, I've never had problems with them again. I'm not sure if it was the cops actually going to their house, or if it was my dad and younger brother threatening them. Or maybe it was me, them hearing me say that I was armed. I don't know, and I don't care. They're still there, but I know they won't do anything, ever again. This is from when my parents first began living together. Katie grew up in a fairly large city, just a few hours from our village. Her mother was a nurse who occasionally brought medical supplies to the more remote areas of the state and provided vaccines for those who wanted them. They met Aga and her family when they were about 9 or 10. They were all friends, and Grandma Mary would sometimes leave Katie and her twin sister Gloria there overnight while she visited other villages. When they reached their teens, Katie and Aga began secretly dating, and eventually they broke the news to their families. Grandma Mary was a devout Catholic and took it surprisingly well. Pawpaw and Ma Aga's parents were a bit unnerved by the whole thing. They had never really dealt with homosexuality within their tribe, and they were convinced that their ancestors would strike them down if they allowed the two girls to continue their courtship. When the community and council members voted on it though, they all agreed so long as Aga and her family maintained their faith and upheld the customs of their people, no harm would come to them from the union. Once they had the blessing from both women's families, they were allowed to move in together. They were barely 17 at the time, but that's how it was within our village. There was no ceremonies, they just went from living apart to living together. This represented betrothal. The house they moved into was small, and only about a half-mile away from the main house, where we eventually moved. But at the time, it was Papa and Moore's house. Katie and Aga swear that the shack was once a charming little cottage, with a beautiful red door and matching shutters. But all I know is that it's currently a condemned structure that gives me splinters just looking at it. Aga worked with her father on most weekdays. Her older brother was a fisherman and he had no interest in the family business, so my mother was next in line to inherit. She loved the cemetery and the funeral home because she felt that she enjoyed providing a place for closure to those who were going through the most challenging times in their lives. Sometimes she worked long hours, so Katie would spend most of her time in the town teaching, or at the house cleaning or cooking. At the time, she wasn't too put off with the cemetery in her backyard. It was a peaceful place, and she never gave it a second thought. One afternoon, she was outside cleaning the windows. She had music playing from the radio inside, so she didn't hear the truck approaching on the dirt path until it was right behind her. She didn't recognize that it was one of Aga's family members' vehicles, so she immediately stopped what she was doing so that she could welcome the stranger. She was a debutante, and hospitality was very important. The man who stepped out the truck was white, which wasn't odd there. There were a few families in the valley, and even some Russians. They rarely made it to this part of the property, though. The main house was where the funeral home was, and all business was performed up there. Thinking that he may have been lost, Katie waved at the gentleman, who had to have been in his late 30s to early 40s. He was handsome, with an almost rugged look to him. Overall, he seemed very approachable. The only thing that seemed off about him was his lack of jacket. He was only wearing a flannel shirt and blue jeans. It was 30 degrees out in our town in this part of the country, where it can sometimes be dark all day. This was one of those times. With no sun and a substantial amount of wind, it was foolish to go outside without some sort of coat. Katie was only out there because the windows were driving her nuts. "How can I help you?" she asked him as he meandered towards the porch. "Do you have a dog?" The guy seemed out of breath as he looked about the property, as though he were looking for something. No, no dog, Katie told him. The stranger pointed to the wooded area on the east side of the property. There's a dog stuck in a trap just off the path over there. Do you know whose it might be? It's brown with a black muzzle. Immediately, Katie stepped off the porch and looked towards the trees. I have no idea. Could you not get it out of the trap? She was, and still is, a sucker for animals. She has a habit of bringing home strays and injured wildlife to this day. I don't have any tools with me. The gentleman pointed to his truck. Do you have a crowbar or even a screwdriver? I can probably take the trap apart if you don't mind keeping the thing calm while I do it. It didn't occur to Katie that it would probably have been better to get someone stronger to assist him than zeroing in on a petite woman who could barely reach the top of her windows. It also didn't occur to her that the man had driven from a different part of the property, and that he would have come from the other side of the house if he was coming from the woods. All she knew was that a dog was hurt, and that she wanted to help it. She ran into the house and dug through the chest, where they kept all the tools that Arga's brother had given them when they moved in. She found the tools he requested, as well as some flashlights, and followed him to his truck. She had not yet been jaded by a world filled with criminals and pervs, so she didn't think twice about going off with a fellow Good Samaritan. The man drove fast, and when they got close to the edge of the forest, he drove off the path to get a shortcut that most of the hunters in the area used. It dawned on Katie that the man didn't have a gun rack in the cab of his truck, and that he was hardly dressed for a hunting trip. She glanced at the floor behind her seat, searching for a coat or some kind of jumper that he may have changed out of, but she didn't see anything of the sort. When the truck stopped, she asked him about his attire. She suggested that they go to her brother-in-law's cabin to get a coat, and he immediately refused. My jacket is with the dog, he explained, motioning for her to follow him up the path. The poor thing looked cold, and I wanted him to be at least a little comfortable as he waited for me. This eased Katie's nerves. He's a nice guy, taking care of a dog. They walked up the path that Katie had only ever been on once or twice before. As kids, they explored the woods, but they never went into this area for fear of being shot. With no daylight, they would at least be safe from hunters, but there were still other elements to worry about, like bears and foxes. The man led the way, shining the flashlight over the path to make sure they were going the right way. They walked for nearly a half hour before Katie stopped and took in the surroundings. She asked if they were getting close to the dog, and the gentleman nodded. It's near the pass up ahead. He's sort of off the path, so keep an ear out. He turned and gave her a smile that even today she calls charming in a Ted Bundy kind of way. As though he sensed her discomfort, the guy started a little dialogue with her. I'm Aaron, by the way. I live out by the border. You from round these parts? Confused, Katie bit back the urge to throw a "no shit" at him. He had just taken her from her house. What did he think? Was she a tourist who cleaned windows for giggles? Rather than be rude, she primly hummed an affirmative, while shining her flashlight right and left, looking for the dog. Are you married? Aaron went on. While Katie asked him what brought him to the conclusion, he reminded her that she'd mentioned a brother-in-law. Is your husband not home? Wife, actually, Katie corrected. She's down the road. She'll be home soon. She felt that it was important to add that, even though it wasn't true, Arga wasn't expected home for another few hours actually, but she wanted to make the guy know that she might have had people looking for her soon. Aaron was quiet for a few seconds. They'd reached a rocky incline on the trail and he seemed to be focusing on that. Once the silence began to settle, he let out a chuckle. That's pretty hot. 2 women in all. While grateful that he wasn't like a lot of people when they first found out about their relationship, rude and disgusted, Katie almost always found his reaction even worse. For the sake of remaining polite, she faked a laugh. Sure. So, how do you know? He stopped walking and turned to face her. Katie really hoped that he wasn't talking about what she thought he was talking about. How do we do what? Screw, he clarified, with a casual shrug. Disgusted, Katie stepped back. That's none of your business. She tried to remain calm, but the man's sudden change in attitude had her on edge. Can we please just get the dog? Oh yeah. Aaron looked around, as though he forgot why they were there in the first place. He laughed sheepishly and shook his head. I'm so sorry, ma'am, but there's no dog. I just brought you out here for a good time. His cavalier attitude gave Katie pause. She let his words sink in for a second, figuring that she had to have misheard. But when he began to unzip his pants, she knew that she had heard right. In Katie's retelling of the event, some small details change here and there, but one thing was always constant in her response at that exact moment of realization. Shit. She didn't give him a chance before slamming her flashlight repeatedly into his head, throat, and chest. She basically hit him as many times as she could until he fell to the ground. When she knew he was unconscious, she turned on heel and ran back the way they came. She didn't know exactly where she was, but she figured that if she stayed on the path, that she would eventually find her way. And she was right. She saw the truck at the edge of the field, right at the opening of the path. She checked the vehicle, and was relieved to see that he'd left the keys in the ignition. She drove it across the field towards the main house, where she found Pawpaw, Arga, and Arga's brother Cal. The 3 of them were horrified when they heard her account of what had just happened, and the men immediately went into the woods to find the injured man. Meanwhile, Arga called the authorities, aka Jimmy, the town-appointed sheriff, with a collection of European muskets and 3 dogs that could tear the skin off a man's bone if ordered to. Jimmy arrived as Pawpaw and Cal were returning, with the latter pulling Aaron by the foot through the mud. He was taken to a jail, aka the concrete cell off Jimmy's house, where he remained until the police from a nearby city came to collect him and perform an official investigation. As it turns out, Aaron was a fisherman from the coast, and he visited friends in our area once or twice a year. He had tagged along with some of these friends when they were visiting Cal at the funeral home, and at some point, it was innocently mentioned that Katie was at the house, and that she was home alone, or something like that. When he found himself with some alone time, Aaron borrowed a truck and found the house and the beautiful Katie alone, as promised. They never really got an answer as to why he thought it was okay to take a woman into the woods for nefarious reasons. He was a relatively attractive guy, and he seemed normal for the most part. In the end, he got a little bit of prison time, and he was banned from our village. That was the most they could do, really, given that he actually didn't do anything to Katie. After all, he was the one who came out with most of the injuries. That's one of the rare occasions that something scary happened on our property that didn't involve the cemetery or funeral home. But it was definitely the first time one of my mothers came face to face with the true evils of the world. Just over 10 years ago, I was fresh out of college and had moved back to my parents' house for the free rent and food for 9 months or so before I was leaving the state for graduate school. Now my parents are super chill and gave me my own space in the house, but being a 22-year-old single guy and living at a house in the sticks, as they had recently moved about 40 miles south of a major Midwest city, is certainly not ideal. But I didn't have any other options, so I started looking for some work to pass the time more than to save up money. Anyway, so summer turned into winter and I still hadn't found anything solid. But by then, I desperately needed to spend more time out of my parents' house, so I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner my dad knew. I didn't really want to do it since it didn't pay much, but it was short-term and wasn't even a real office setup. But again, my parents lived in the middle of nowhere Midwest. Think acres and acres of farms. And I knew I had limited local opportunities to make some cash. And this guy was going to pay me under the table as well. About that time, a friend of mine in the city said that if I had just paid him $200 a month and helped clean up, he'd have let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. That was all I needed to hear. I took the job. So my dad's friend's family had a construction-type business. They helped out with building stuff, but it was more ultimately focused on renting out a few bobcats and larger augers they owned, and other various drills, and then odds and ends like generators and other low-level construction or farming equipment that someone in the area couldn't afford to purchase but needed to use from time to time. This was a small mum-and-pop style thing, where everyone knew everyone, and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by, and was just generally a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I had minored in a business-adjacent area, and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to go in there for about 15 to 20 hours a week and check and file the rental forms, make sure nobody missed payment days, and if there were payment plans in place, answer an email or two, and talk discussing prices and availability. Super easy gig. The old building where I worked was 90 years old, and on top of this little hill, and the downstairs used to be an old country bar until the 70s, when this family bought it cheap, cleared out the bar and fenced in the property to use it as a parking lot to store all their rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I please. I worked any hours I wanted to, as long as the work was done. So if things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a few days, I'd usually go in after 7 and stay until around midnight or 1, since I knew I'd be alone and could listen to music out loud and take my time. The office where I worked was on the second floor of the building above the old bar, and looked out onto the long driveway. From my seat, I could easily see out the window, and once or twice saw a family of deer or a raccoon scamper by, and I always glanced out when I saw movement, since it was very noticeable. It was incredibly remote, very still and quiet, so if something unusual occurred, or if something felt off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, and my dad told me to stay in because the roads were bad. But I had an old SUV, and more than that, just really wanted to get out of the house. So I went into work at about 8 p.m. and was going to stay until just after 1. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill, since, believe me when I say, nobody ever showed up at night, since we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I think the nearest occupied house was about 2 miles down the road, and to even turn onto our short road, you had to only be coming to our specific building and probably knew where it was beforehand. It was a locals only type thing and very small since the family had inherited a lot of money and kind of did this rental thing on the side. Basically, someone would never just get lost and end up at our building. So I'm jamming away to some Fall Out Boy. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young, and having some coffee and kept glancing at the snow outside here and there, since our one orangish street light was reflecting onto the ground at the gate and was causing the light to shine off the snow in a really cool and pretty way. At one point around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom to do my bathroom business, and then came back upstairs and got settled into work. I probably did about 5 minutes worth of work when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge dog or substantial animal had rolled around on the ground there. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened when I was in the bathroom, or perhaps when my back was turned, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a dog, or maybe even a farm animal, as it was common in this type of area. I assumed it gotten loose and maybe was attracted to the light. Who knows? At around 2 in the morning, I was getting ready to leave, and as always, got out of my car to lock the gate up, and I'll be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow, but the undeniable imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's when kids lie on their backs in the snow, push their arms and legs back forth, so when they get up, it looks like the outline of an angel. I used to do this when I was a kid, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was, and it was deliberately made underneath the light post. But it wasn't from a kid. It was from a very large person, or at the very least a normal-sized adult, wearing tons of layers of big winter clothing. I looked up and saw what I already knew, that whoever had made this snow angel could have easily looked up and seen me through the window, so they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make it. Now I definitely would have seen or heard someone drive up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom, so I knew someone had to have walked up in the freezing cold snow for miles, stopped in front of our building, did a snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk, and I glanced around for tracks in the snow, and saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods right out of the building. So it was clear the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me instantly uneasy, since that side was just trees and darkness for miles. I was definitely a little freaked out now, once I realized that someone had just been this close to me secretly in the middle of the woods, and I looked around but didn't see anything amiss at all, and now I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back in my car and drove a few feet, I realized my boss would be there in about 4 hours, and might see the snow angel and assume I did it, since he probably assumed I kept the gate locked when I was there. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal at all, but I was young and felt like I might be made fun of by him, if nothing else, as they were all manly men, and I liked books. So I opened the gate back up real quick, ran over and kicked the snow around so it hid the angel, locked it up, and went back to my car. I wasn't exactly fully terrified at this point, even though it was certainly unsettling. I just thought it was really weird and could have been an illegal hunter, even though hunting in the night in the cold didn't make much sense. Regardless, the imprint was made 2 hours earlier, and I assumed that they were gone. But that's when I heard it. When I was getting into my SUV, there was the loudest high-pitched laugh coming from the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like how the witch in The Wizard of Oz would laugh or something. Like someone was doing it on purpose to show they weren't scared of me, or how I'd react all at once. I knew they were laughing at me on our property. It was close enough that I knew that they could probably see me, but I couldn't see them, since, other than the street light, there was no illumination. After a few seconds of laughter they stopped, and then it was just silence everywhere, except for my heart beating through my ears. Then the laughing started again, louder this time, more like screaming and laughing combined. I sort of froze for 5 seconds, listening in a panic. Now I've spent a lot of time in that area, and I knew what coyotes and foxes sound like at night with their high-pitched screeches during mating season, so I can't completely logistically rule that out. But to me, it honestly sounded like an adult man trying to emulate a woman laughing, like someone who was deliberately trying to make a fake, scary shriek laugh in order to scare someone. And it worked. After those 5 seconds, I was filled with adrenaline, got into my car, and drove the hell away from there as fast as I could without sliding off the road. Back at home, I was up all night trying to figure it out, and told my parents the story when they awoke. After talking it out, we decided it was one of two things. It was either my brain somehow convincing myself that the snow formation was angel-shaped, when it was really just caused by an animal, and then the snow tracks and laughing were just a coyote or red fox, though I don't think that's what it was. What I truly believe is the second thing, which is that some local was out walking around for some reason and decided to mess with me. I didn't have any close friends left in the area that would do this, and if they did, they certainly would have brought it up to make fun of me for speeding away in terror. I found out later the nearest house was a super old couple, so I highly doubt that it was any of them, which means whomever it was went out into the woods in the night in the freezing cold just to mess with a stranger. I don't have any mental issues, family history of them, don't do drugs, but I do drink socially, but I didn't that night. I also don't believe in the paranormal, so I never once gave it a thought. I know in my heart, someone was out there. I worked there another 6 weeks or so and never had a single issue, though I know where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there when I started my shift, and I certainly always locked the gate from then on. Thinking about this experience that night, the part that freaked me out the most was that he'd have had to have waited around for me to leave for about 2 hours just to do that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been crazy, and the type of person to get mad and try and find him and attack him, yet he didn't seem scared or care while he tried to mess with me. For some random dude, this is probably a story he tells from his point of view to somehow make his friends giggle in hysteria. But for me, that dude, and the one I call Angel in the Snow guy, the one with the laugh I'll never forget, let's not meet. This happened to me over a year ago, at the end of March 2017. And I still can't be alone in my own home. 3 years earlier, I had moved into a house that my grandparents left me before they passed away. I'd spent some time renovating, and was happy enough with it to move in. My grandparents had rented out the top floor to students, and had made it into a SMA apartment. When I moved in, I decided to let my cousin, who had some small personal problems, to move upstairs, while my fiancé and I used the 2 remaining floors for ourselves. We lived in a small town, and like in any small town, everyone basically knows everyone. And like most men in our town, my fiancé is a fisherman, and goes away for long periods of time during the winter, sometimes from January to May. In our town, there are 2 brothers that are, well, I guess you can call them weird. Some may say original. Though we all know they had struggles in the past, that's probably the reason to their behavior. But my path never crossed theirs, and I never spoke to them, mostly due to an age difference. On this particular night, I was home alone. My fiancée was up north fishing, and my cousin was visiting family. I had come home late from work and was just chilling with a glass of wine in front of the TV. I can't remember what's going on. I usually just needed to empty my head after work, so I was just sitting there in the dark with nothing but the lights from the TV, lost in my own thoughts after the long evening shift. That's when I thought I heard some sounds outside. Usually when I hear sounds like that, I brush it off. I live in an old house. Old houses do make sounds randomly, and it was absolutely pouring with rain outside. Only once had it gotten that it was actually someone out there, and at the time, it had been an Eastern European group of guys scouting our house, since some groups, like that, travel around to small places to do burglary and petty crimes. I had this in mind, but I had not been home at the point. Only my fiancée and cousin were, and they ran after them, and the men jumped into their car and were never seen again. I told myself the sound I had just heard was either the house or the rain, until I hear another sound again, more clearly this time, and this time it came from the deck, on the side of the house where I was sitting. I froze as I heard steps moving closer to the window where I sat. The first window this person would come to, moving from that side of the house, would be to my bedroom. He or she wouldn't see anything inside there. The curtains were drawn and the lights were off. The steps kept moving towards the door we had on that side of the house, and I knew once they got there, they would be able to stare directly at me through the door window. I quickly turned off the TV so the room got dark. By doing this, I would for sure be telling them that I was home, unless they came from the forest behind the house, which means they had to climb and crawl a lot, and they would have seen that the TV was on from the front. To give you an idea of how my floor plan is, my house is built so that from the front you see the kitchen through 2 windows, and the living room through 1. Moving around the house to the back, you have the window to the bathroom, bedroom, and the door to the living room. And on one side you have a couple of big windows into the living room, and on the opposite side the entrance to the hall. And all around the ground floor we have a deck. So I sat still, my heart beating fast. I could barely breathe while I heard the steps, now slower, coming closer to the door. The wood on the deck making sounds as the weight of the person pushed down on it. That's when I see a big shadow of a man outside the window, stopping and looking in. I stayed still in the chair. I was sitting, hoping it was dark enough that he couldn't see me. As he started moving again, I gasped for air. I could hear him walking into my outdoor furniture and stopping. He probably didn't see them in the dark. For a split second I debated with myself if I should go and turn on the deck lights, but I didn't want to let him know that I had seen him, scared of what this person could do. I lived in a small town, in one of the most baby-proofed countries in the world. These things were not supposed to happen here. Well, at least, I had felt safe up until then. It could have been someone pranking me thinking they were hilarious, but I was not willing to take that chance. I grabbed my phone and ran as quickly as I could out the kitchen and hid under the open counter area. I knew he wouldn't be able to spot me there from any window if I sat still. I quickly started dialing my dad's number, figuring it was either him or my brother who could come and help me fast enough. We share police with a neighbouring town, and they are usually stationed there, which means it would take them at least 35 minutes to get to me. Though it was late, my dad was quick to pick up, figuring I wouldn't call him that late if it wasn't important. I whispered quickly into the phone so fast and with such a low voice that my dad couldn't hear me, and I had to repeat myself. "There's someone outside the house. He just looked through the window." As I said it a second time, I couldn't hold back my tears, and I began sobbing. My dad told me to stay put, and he would be on his way. He hung up, and I can remember how I had wished he wouldn't have done that. I would have felt safer had he stayed on the line, but I would soon find out why he did this. I tried to call my fiancé, and it went straight to voicemail. And again, straight to voicemail. I stared at my phone, hoping someone would call, trying to keep out the sounds of the footsteps that I could hear coming closer to the kitchen. Then absolute silence. I held my breath, listening. But I could only hear my own heartbeats. Had he jumped off the deck to the side where it was the closest to the ground? I waited before I crawled out and carefully peeked out one of the kitchen windows. I spotted him walking slowly away from the house down my driveway. Then he stopped and turned around, looking towards the window where I was sitting. Was he smiling? I couldn't tell. It was so dark, and the streetlights were not bright enough to illuminate him clearly. But I could have sworn he was smiling at me. At the same time, my driveway got lit up with lights from a car, and I could see who he was, before he ran into the neighbor's driveway and vanished behind some bushes. I jumped up when I realized whose car it was. It was my dad's business partner, John. I ran out towards him. My dad had called him and asked him to go to my house because he lived a lot closer. I had never been happier to see him. I quickly told him who I had seen, and he assured me that my dad was only minutes away before he jumped into his car to pursue the man. The man I had seen had been one of the brothers that we all found weird, the one known to be a schizophrenic drug addict. But why had he been outside my house? He wasn't known to burgle people's homes. My dad came and called the police, who took a statement. John came back and said that he had been unable to spot him, and that he had probably hid in the forest on the other side of my neighbor's house. The police couldn't arrest the guy since he hadn't done anything. Scaring the living hell out of someone was not a big enough crime, but they knew who he was and promised to talk to him and tell him to stop scaring people. As for me, they told me to call them if he ever did it again. I didn't stick around to see if he returned that night. I packed up some things and stayed over at my parents' house until my cousin came home 2 days later. This happened earlier this summer. I was on vacation with my cousin. We were both 16, as well as my uncle, in upstate New York, pretty much Canada. We had a pretty nice house, along with a small cabin on the same property that my cousin and I were staying in by a lake, that was really nice and in the middle of nowhere. It was about 40 minutes to the nearest gas station. On our part/section of the lake, there were 2 other houses, one about half a mile away from us and the other even further than that. Our house is right up on the lake, but with a small section of the forest that we have to walk through. About 5 feet of trees from the yard to the water to get to the dock. The trees are right up against the water with no beach. My cousin and I decide to go sit on the dock at around midnight. We're sitting on the dock for 20 minutes when we heard loud crunching footsteps in the trees about 5 yards to the left of the dock, in the trees, right on the shoreline. It could only have been a bear, deer, or human, judging from the sound. My uncle had a chihuahua, so that was out of the question. We wanted to sprint inside, but didn't in case it was a bear or moose that would chase us. So we stayed out on the dock to try and see what it was. The footsteps stopped for a bit. As we were trying to look past the trees, a flashlight shined out from the trees and onto us. We booked it inside, where we saw my uncle and dog sitting on the couch. We searched the whole property and couldn't find anyone or anything, and I still have no idea who it was. It was in October of 2016. My then girlfriend broke up with me a week prior to this time. It did have an emotional impact on me, and I desperately needed something to lift me out of my mood. I was on Snapchat looking through the stories, and I see my then friend named Emilio had posted on his story, and it showed that he was outside the local Winn-Dixie in a car blasting rap music with somebody who I thought looked like a school shooter. Not long after the story, I get a phone call from Emilio. "Yo, you want to sneak out?" "I shouldn't. I'm working on my English 2 homework." Now, you see, Emilio isn't necessarily the kind of person who takes no for an answer. He may ask at least twice if you refuse. And after my excuses, he says, "Come on, you know you don't want to do your homework. Besides, you can come and smoke with us." When he said smoke, I automatically assumed he was talking about the green stuff. So I reluctantly agreed to meet him somewhere in my neighborhood. It was a pain to sneak out my house, since all the doors have squeaky hinges, let alone having a dog. I get my dog to sit outside the door that squeaks the least after I leave, which, thinking about it, made me feel like a total ass. I go to the parking lot of a local business and hide near the dumpster, call Emilio, and ask when they should be there. He says 5 minutes, and that they're going to show up in a white van. I chuckle, because there was no way in hell he was going to get in a white van. 5 minutes pass, and I see headlights approach, and take a guess what I see. A van. I felt all the color drain from my face, as I made the realization that the situation was bad. The van stops a few meters from me, and I force myself to approach it, since I had no other choice. I get inside, and it smells like what I can closely relate to toilet cleaner. The inside was disgusting, a blanket with various particles on it, and a very messy floor, as if someone lived in it. Emilio introduces his friend, Camden, and Lord Almighty, this guy looked like the type of person you'd find in a crack house. He had thin, wavy hair that went past his shoulders, green, buggy eyes, a moustache of a 7th grader who thinks he has facial hair, and a heavy build. I sit in the van as it drives out the neighborhood, projecting the best I could. After a few minutes, we drive to a place where people can fish. The guys had a box for an old iPhone, and inside that box were small crystals. It hit me right then and there that I snuck out to hang out with 2 meth heads. Right away, I told them I didn't want to smoke, and Amelia was fine with it, but I couldn't speak for Camden. I brought my cigarettes and lighter that night, and Emilio ends up using all my lighter fluid, which really annoyed me. But I held a poker face about it. In the background, while I watched him light a bowl of meth, A song named Chasing Dragons was playing. To this day, that song haunts me. Camden asks me if I can drive, as he was hinting that we rob a store up ahead. Emilio was against it, and Camden was like, I'm joking. In retrospect, I seriously hope he was. We ended up going to a Walmart. We were there for a while, and at some point I'm left alone with Camden. He begins babbling some stupid stuff, and again that's where my projection came into play. But the scariest part of that was when he was trying to get me interested in hanging out with him. Camden offered to drive me to school, and I agree. But in that instant I remembered that my mum agreed to take me to school that morning, so I let him know. Almost immediately after I said that, he got aggressive. Really? Are you bullshitting me? It sounded like he was threatening me. And when Emilio comes back out after a while, we leave. In the parking lot, we rendezvous in the van, and they have the bright idea of smoking more bowls. Camden hits the bowls, then he puts the pipe out like he was offering it to me. And right away I spit out, I'm good. He replies, oh, good job. I made it abundantly clear to them that I'd never touch that stuff, thanks to some screwed up commercials I saw as a kid. But I feel like Camden didn't give a shit. Finally, time to go home. It was quite nerve-wracking, and he was speeding like a NASCAR driver. I was just praying he didn't get pulled over. We get at my house, and it's all over. I dropped him 2 weeks after this happening, but that wasn't the last time I saw him. One time when I was mowing my lawn at sundown, I saw the same van. I saw Emilio and Camden high off their asses smiling at me through the windshield, when I realized what just happened. I stopped what I was doing, run back inside, grabbed my knife, and called my sister on her way home from work to be careful when she pulls in, because my paranoia told me they were going to come over. Thankfully, they didn't, and I hope to never meet them again. In 2011, I was an art and design student in London. London was a daunting place at this time, with increasing crime issues, and coming from a small rural fishing village up north, I was unfamiliar with the layout of the land, as well as the multifaceted cultural scene in the city. Nevertheless, there was a great allure to the big smoke. Over the course of the next few months, I picked up work in a busy bar in East London. As a small, petite, and shy girl, I found the job very challenging, and found social interactions amongst the regular punters both daunting and intimidating. I still remember my very first shift, taking the rubbish out onto the ice-cold street, to be met with the harsh smell of sick and the stern voice of an elderly gentleman proclaiming that London is no longer safe. And this was my first interaction with a man called Harry. And while I initially grew inquisitive as to this man's nature, I soon receded into the solitary nature with which I was accustomed when faced with the stark realization of what this man was. As a regular at the pub, he was familiar with all regular servers, and as the pub was a small affair, the cozy nature often drew in the same crowd. As an outsider entering a big city for the first time, and with an increasing distaste for my opted-for degree, I'm sad to admit that I began neglecting my studies, and with the extortionate cost of living in London, it was necessary for me to pick up more hours at the pub. I grew to trust Harry, and equally, he began to confide in me. There was something about this man that intrigued me. There was a lot more below the surface, and I wanted to find out what that was. Over the course of the next few weeks, he confided in me about his family life, which seemed fairly normal. and I'm not one to quickly judge, but there were some subtle clues that this man drowned a deprived sorrow in his mind. However, one day, Harry stopped coming to the bar. This was not picked up on by anyone else as similar to me. Harry appeared to be an outsider, which was part of the reason we bonded so much. Nevertheless, the loss of his presence did surprise me, and I was soon again alone in the bustling metropolis. A couple of weeks passed, and I had just started to accept the fact that Harry was never going to be seen again, which I attributed to a potential cross-country relocation, to be closer to the family he told me was up north too. That was, until I found the doll posted through the letterbox of my rented accommodation. The doll was dirty, with matted hair, and looked dated. My first inclination was that a delivery had been posted to the wrong address, yet no envelope or stamp was present. I will clarify at this point that I confided in no one about this strange occurrence, which I would in hindsight attribute both to my fear of crowds and underthinking the potential ramifications of this incident. I continued to work for a few more weeks at the bar, though as winter receded another strange occurrence materialized. I was tapped on the back by a bar manager and asked to follow her through the office beside the kitchen in the bar, which we often used for eating lunch or taking a brief break between busy times. I shrank into myself when I saw that a dress was pinned to the wall in the room, with a note pinned on it with my name. The dress had the same dated appearance as the child's doll, and was similarly dirty. My heart skipped a beat as I linked the two incidents, and immediately confided in my manager about the previous occurrence. I did not immediately link the two incidents to the disappearance of my workplace local Harry. That much I can attribute to my manager, who I am thankful for to this day, as she later attested to the fact that many years prior to my entering into the bar, Harry had lost his granddaughter, for which he was the primary carer, in a terrible childhood accident. He had spoken about it at length to the bar manager over the years, and apparently I had a strikingly similar appearance, particularly due to my petite nature. Needless to say, I left the job with immediate effect and moved back home. I never did see Harry again. But Harry, let's not meet again. I've always worked for security companies. You name it, I've done it. Private venues, events, buildings, and now lately, dilapidated structures. I was in charge of looking after this building at night. I don't even know why they needed security. It was grotty, it was dingy, and it reeked in certain parts. Without a doubt, animals had got in and never found their way out, and the stench of their corpses rotting around the building were incredibly off-putting in the summer heat. Let me give you a bit of background. This building that I worked in was in the most remote part I had ever worked. Most of the time, I had to work in the city, but the guys I worked for told me about this opportunity. It was far out and about an hour's drive, but the pay was lucrative and well worth the effort. I would be working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The job? Ensuring no one broke into this busted down building. I tried asking for details about why they'd want to keep this place after going there a few times, but my employers could not or did not know the reasons. This place, as I said before, was nothing special. In fact, it was an eyesore in the middle of the forest. I don't know what it was before. It had been well gutted and any traces of what it could have previously been had obviously been removed. To me, it was just the decaying shell of a building. I still am itching to know what was there before. It spurs my interest, and when I was doing my rounds, I'd look about to see if I could find bits of paper, documentation, or anything like that. Usually, when companies close down buildings, they don't even bother removing the contents. They just close it, and whatever's left inside is left there. I've been in buildings plenty of times, with loads of files and information, sometimes even electronics, that they've just blatantly left to rot forever. But, in this case, there was nothing. I was doing my rounds as usual, having only worked there for 2 weeks. This was easily one of the easiest jobs I had ever done. All I had to do was patrol twice a night. It's not like anyone was here to check up on me anyway. But I did my patrols, made sure everything was good, and would just scroll through my phone, reading, listening, doing all kinds of stuff. The night was my own, and this hardly felt like work. However, through the sea of cameras that I had in front of me, checking on all the decay, did something flash on the top rightmost monitor. There was movement. The movement was definitely human. This person moved, almost glided across the screen. I saw this person, and in a blink they were gone. I'd only caught them a little too late, as I had been browsing Reddit. I checked the section and knew exactly where they were, not 3 minutes away from my station. So I grabbed my flashlight and quietly made my way round, seeing if I could hear anything. When I reached the area, I patrolled as quietly as I could and found nothing. After not finding anyone or hearing anything, I resorted to shouting, telling them that they were on private property and that if they didn't reveal themselves now, I'd call the cops. Empty threats, but sometimes you have to employ these. There was nothing. I searched for a good 20 minutes in vain, and this site was absolutely huge, so there's no way I was going to invest more time, and retreated back to my little hideout, monitoring the cameras more carefully this time, but for the entirety of the night, I didn't see a single thing. Weeks passed without incident, and the previous event had now, in the back of my mind, been labelled as a blimp, something that I had obviously misseen while browsing my phone, and left it at that. It was around this time that after I was relieving Robbie from the day shift, did I strike up a conversation with him. We usually chit-chatted a little bit, but I had arrived a little bit earlier than anticipated, with there being far less traffic on the road, and we started talking. He was just getting ready to leave, when out of nowhere he looked at me and said, "Have you ever seen something in the camera?" I didn't reply and gave him a quizzical look. He continued, "I've seen some things, man. In the morning sometimes. I don't know." He looked down at his feet, started rubbing them against the floor, grabbed his bag, and without another word was gone. Was he just telling me this place was haunted or something? I tried laughing it off, knowing full well in the back of my mind that I had seen something, but chose to keep that to myself. I didn't want him to think me mad. A few weeks down the line, and nothing eventful had happened. All that I knew is that I had this job, and it was super easy. But it was on this night that everything changed. I was doing my rounds, and as I was walking down a decaying hallway, did I hear something? It sounded like laughter. The laughter of children. At least 2 or 3. Now, I've had my run-in with urban explorers in other places, but never here. but who the hell would bring their children in the middle of the night to a decaying building? That is beyond me. I ran and screamed for them to stop, running in the direction I swore I heard them in. When I reached it, it was just an empty room. I listened, and I heard them again. This time, they were in the direction that I had just come from. Now, to describe this place, I was in a corridor. There was only one way to get to the room I went to, and unless they passed me in the darkness and were completely immune to my flashlight illuminating them, there was no way I could have missed them. Upon running that way, I made extra careful to ensure I looked everywhere, and told them to stop. When I reached the room, nothing. Again. I was becoming very scared at this point. Twice I had heard children laughing and the sound of young feet hitting the ground. I'm not gonna lie, I just about wanted to pack up my stuff and go home, so I quietly began making my way to the stairs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, just footsteps, coming from above me. They were running down at speed. Fight or flight kicked in. Was I going to confront this intruder? Hell no. I grabbed my flashlight tightly in my hand and bolted it down the stairs, jumping 2, sometimes 3 a go, trying to make my way to the bottom as quickly as I could. I ran out, hit the ground floor, flew out the fire exit, and didn't look back. I heard the door slam shut as I made my exit, and not 3 seconds later did I hear it slam open. It was with such force that it hit the back wall with a loud smack. I didn't stop running. I made it to my car, switched the engine on, and was about to peel out of there when I looked around. There was nothing. I made sure my car was locked up and waited in silence just to check. Had I imagined it? Surely not. But I sat there, sweat dripping down my back and neck, in utter terror. I think it took me an hour before I felt safe enough to leave my vehicle. Thoughts plaguing my mind of the intruder hiding behind my car outside my field of vision, waiting to jump me the moment I exit the safety of my vehicle. When I did leave, I looked around. There was nothing. I went to check the door, which had slammed with such force I was sure it had broken off its hinges. But when I went to check, it was closed. There didn't even appear to be a dent in the wall as I had suspected. Maybe it wasn't as hard as I thought. I went back to my security station and reviewed the footage. I looked, and it was just me running away from nothing. The cameras didn't pick up anything. Just a crazy security guard running from thin air down the stairs and through the grass to the car. I sat there shocked. Was I tired? Hallucinating? I didn't know. All that I knew was that I was done with this place. In the morning, when my relief came, I looked at him straight in the eye and said, "You're right. There is something about this place, and I'm not coming back to find out. Good luck." I told my company that I didn't want to be stationed there anymore, and within a few days I was stationed at a nice, unhaunted building in the middle of the city, with great Wi-Fi. That's where I stayed for a few more years, but the thought in the back of my mind always did remain. Was that place seriously haunted? Or was it all in my mind? Maybe I'll never know, and maybe that's for the better. I was catching a ride home from work one day at my last job, and the guy who was taking me home was always active, and spoke about how he loved his daughter and blah blah blah. Anyway, we're in the car, and I'm gonna be honest, I liked to smoke weed. Occasionally I've done other things, but nothing I would consider hardcore. As I'm sitting in this man's car, he pulled out this glass pipe and asked if I wanted a hit. I know weed, and I know what weed pipes look like. I asked him what it was because I knew it wasn't weed, and he just said, "What do you think?" This is the point I'm uncomfortable, because at the time I was on probation for felonies, and I had a great first offenders program, which I was in, and didn't want to mess it up because, yeah, who wants 2 felonies? Back to the car ride. I guessed it was a crack pipe. I'd never seen one, and also never had seen this pipe. So, that was my educated guess. And that's when the guy goes, "Do I look like a crackhead?" This guy had prison tattoos, shaved head, and a ponytail. With which I had no response, and quickly he gave me the reply. "This is meth." I quickly declined the generous offer, and thankfully I was very near my house because for the rest of the 2 minutes left on the ride was spent in very awkward and nervous silence. So today I write about you, my meth head friend, for you have showed me the difference of thy crack to thy meth head. This didn't happen to me, but my grandpa. My family owns a chunk of land about an hour outside of Yellowstone National Park. It's very beautiful but very remote. We go up there every summer for a few weeks, but my grandpa lives there for the whole summer. So he does most of the upkeep around the property, maintaining fences, oiling the cabin, and clearing out dead trees. So decades ago, way before I was born, my grandpa was out on the property, replacing parts of the fence. He did the work alone, but always brought his German Shepherd Scout along with him for company. So my grandpa is finishing up his work, and it's approaching dusk, when he hears Scout whining. He looks up. The dog is alert and just staring into the woods. He didn't think too much of it, and guessed he probably just smelled a grouse or some other small animal. So my grandpa finishes packing up his tools and is ready to head out to the cabin. He calls Scout, but he won't move. He's staring into the woods. My grandpa literally has to grab Scout by the scruff and turn him around before they start heading down the trail. You have to understand that Scout was a good dog and always listened to my grandpa, so ignoring commands was very abnormal. So they're walking down the trail. It's only about a 10-minute walk to the cabin, but it's through some of the thickest forest on the property, and it's getting dark fast. The whole time my grandpa said he felt a growing sense of unease, like he was being followed. Scout would stop every few steps and turn around and growl, staring into the trees. My grandpa would stop sometimes to look out, but never saw anything. This continued the whole way home. They finally reached the clearing where the cabin was built, and obviously my grandpa is relieved. He gets to the front door, and Scout is next to him, barking like mad at the trail they just left. So my grandpa looks over one more time, and he finally sees it. On the edge of the clearing, staring right back at him, is a mountain lion. Scout is long gone, but my grandpa swears that dog saved his life. Mountain lions like to ambush their prey, but Scout likely prevented that from happening. This happened about a decade ago. It wasn't a situation where I was necessarily in danger, but who knows what their intentions were. It was just creepy and weird. A little backstory. I graduated high school the same year both my sisters graduated from college. One of my sisters went to school in a really small town, about an hour from Buffalo, New York. Her graduation was after mine, so my mum and I went and stayed up there for about a week. One night, my sister was staying with us in the hotel room when the phone rings. It was 10 o'clock at night, maybe later. We didn't really think anything of it, since we really were in the middle of nowhere, and cell phone service was pretty poor. It could have just been her boyfriend trying to get a hold of her. I answered the phone, and it was just some random guy who responded with, "Hi there," or something like that. When I asked who he was, he just said, "I saw you go into your room. You're really pretty." Whether he thought he was talking to me or my sister hardly mattered. It didn't change how weird the fact that he called was. I guess he was hoping for whoever it was to be flattered, and that we'd spend the night talking or come hung out with him, or who knows. I don't think I ever responded to him. Before, my sister asked who it was, and I told her I had no idea, so she told me to hang up. I told him that's what I was doing, and he asked why. I was just so baffled by the whole situation, and had no reason to answer him. But I was honest to a fault and told him, because she told me to, even though I would have hung up regardless. To this he mockingly repeated, "Because my sister told me to," like a child would over and over. I said, "Wow, that's mature," and hung up the phone. He didn't try calling again while we were in the room at least, but the initial phone call gave me such a weird feeling that I was kind of on edge whenever we were at a hotel after that. Obviously this guy knew what we looked like, and exactly which room we were staying in, as well as being most likely a guest in the hotel too. Really, for all I knew, he could have even worked there. But to the guy who called my hotel room late at night, let's not meet again. This story is from my cousin Steve. Steve is an outdoorsy person. He likes to camp and hike and stuff. He never gave me specifics on where he was with this story, so it could be anywhere in a forested area in the wilderness. He said it was late in September/early October, something like that, and this was in 2004. He set up a little campsite in a small clearing no bigger than a large living room. The first night, everything was fine. No troubles at all. But that afternoon, quite a while after he'd woken back up, he felt oddly drawn to somewhere off in the distance in the forest. He said he was like on autopilot and wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. Steve said he wasn't too far away from the campsite into the trees when he noticed what looked like a toppled over grave. That's how he described it, at least. A rectangular slab of stone. But he said it was weirdly out of place and definitely didn't belong there. It looked polished, sort of glossy and reflective. There was no writing or scrawling on it. It was smooth and plain, but despite it sitting on a pile of dead leaves, there was no forest debris on it, no twigs fallen, or even moss on it. It was very unusual, especially considering, to his knowledge, there was nobody around for miles, but it looked like it had been placed there very recently. At the moment, Steve said that he felt as though he had been picked up and dropped randomly somewhere on Earth, and had zero clue where he was. He said, even though he could clearly make out the red canvas or nylon or whatever his tent may be 25 feet or so behind him, he said he was just utterly confused and totally unfamiliar with his surroundings. Then he said that two things happened very quickly. First, he felt an ice-cold wave of air hit him, like a cold wind on a frigid winter day, despite it being relatively warm for early autumn, and there was no wind present. The branches on the trees hadn't moved, and the leaves on the ground didn't budge at all. Second, he heard what sounded like a loud, deafening clap, like someone clapped their hands just once, really hard, and it echoed across the valley. Next thing he knew, the sun is already dipping below the horizon, and it's pretty dark in the woods. Only a split second earlier, it had been 3:30 in the afternoon. Now it was closer to 8 at night, in the blink of an eye. Steve said he did not see the stone on the ground anywhere, and he booked it to his tent, scared out of his mind. According to him, it wouldn't be a good idea to pack everything up right now at dusk and try to make his way back during the night, so he'd have to wait until the morning to do so. He said he barely slept the entire night. All the while he heard a seriously creepy sound not too far from the tent. He said it sounded like someone snoring, and it might have simply been a sleeping animal, like a bear or mountain lion. Not too sure if they snore, but they probably do. He waited a little bit until after dawn, and he packed up his stuff and got out of there, with the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he was in the woods. This was years ago, when I was 19 years old and working at a phone store. I was closing up for the night alone, when a man walked into the store before I could lock up. He then turned around, locked the door himself, and switched the sign to closed. I knew right then and there that I was being robbed. He looked at me with a hand in his jacket and says, "I want a phone, and I don't want to pay." I give this dude the biggest grin and say, "Whatever you want, boss," and I immediately walk to get him the newest iPhone, because he came off as an iPhone guy to me. Though I do remember being really annoyed that he dragged in a bunch of mud and water through the store. The dude was soaking wet because it was raining, and I was livid that I'd have to mop the floor again. You think of strange things in these situations. He then starts talking about how he has a gun, which was unneeded as I got the hint, and also begins talking about how he wants the phone hooked up with service. I found this to be an extremely odd request coming from the guy robbing me. I mean, you'd think he'd just tell me to give him all the money and phones in the store, but then I realized why he made this request. He starts screaming at the alarm on the wall, and I mean really screaming. I realize immediately this guy was on drugs, and I might die in this store tonight. I get this man an account, hook everything up, and I just wanted to give him what he wanted and get him out. As I'm doing this, he's walking around out of curiosity, grabs a ball, crumples a paper over it and unlocks the door, and buries it. He then comes back inside and says, "Don't worry, it'll grow into something much better." I could see all of it because the entire front of the store was glass. I just give him a weak chuckle and went with it. But then someone else pulls up into the store. It was my mum. She was picking me up because that very morning I had gotten into an accident and totaled my car. So she was going to drive me back to my place until I got a rental. After a little bit, she called the police because she knew something was wrong and correctly assumed I was being robbed. By the way, the whole process took forever. My life was on the line and I couldn't hook up the phone any faster than I'd like to. So, the guy is obviously complaining. Finally, I got his phone hooked up. He walked out the store and let his dog out the car and started driving crazy around the parking lot until the cops showed up. I bought a lottery ticket on that day, convinced that I used up all my bad luck for the year in a day. I still didn't win. Quick tidbit about myself. I help people as often as I can, including giving money to the homeless, or giving rides to hitchhikers if I'm going in the same direction. 98% of the time, the worst I've encountered is awkward conversation and being asked if I have meth to sell. No matter what though, I don't mess with people at night or in groups, and I keep weaponry on hand, though I've never even needed to show it. This is not one of those times. I've lived in a lower income area of my city, and only about a half mile from the local homeless shelter. So I've seen plenty of people in a sad state during the 2 years I lived there. My apartment building kind of sat in a small valley, with a little ravine across the street that deer hung out in. They liked our bus shelter on really rainy days, and I lived on the 3rd floor. So one day I come home. It's blowing snow at around 15 degrees. In my entryway is a dude sitting on the staircase. It was obvious he was homeless and looking for a place to warm up, as he was wearing 4 days' worth of clothes at once and had 2 backpacks with him. This isn't a big deal, as long as he's not still there when the building is locked up for the day. As I pass him on the staircase, I give him a smile, as I do to literally every other stranger not screaming at me on the planet. He stops me and tries to strike up a conversation. Now it's obvious he doesn't speak very good English, but I was able to discern that he was asking for water and he was waiting for a friend who lived in the building to come home. Yup, no problem. I head up to my apartment to grab water for him, and he follows. This was a bit uncomfortable, but I was already having a hard time communicating with him, so I just let it slide. This is where things go wonky. My apartment was an efficiency, where the bathroom was right inside the front door and then a tiny hallway into everything else. I walk to the kitchen to get the water and he points to the bathroom. Yeah, sure dude. I have cleaning supplies. That's what they're there for. So I go around the corner, pull out a few bottles of water from the fridge, come back, and he's standing there, buck naked, in my hallway. Then it dawns on me, water. He was asking for a shower. Oh God. Then he tries to ask me to join him. No. Hard no. You understand no. He goes into the shower and I pace in my living room trying to figure out how the hell I can communicate with him that he needs to leave. 'Cause we went from uncomfortable to creeptastic in 0.6 seconds. Then it gets worse. He comes out again buck naked without a towel and begins wandering around my apartment commenting on everything. Oh, and he's hard. Yep, I lose myself, politely, because once you're in retail that never goes away. Trying to get him to put his clothes on, and he doesn't understand. I pull up my phone, pull up Google Translate, and show him the list of languages. He understood what I was asking and selected Somalian. Goody, progress. Now, the thing he's commenting on, in terrible half-English, is things like, "You live alone? Does this TV work? Nope, 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 done." I type into Google Translate asking if he needed to call his friend or call the apartment manager. He gives me a thumbs up, then climbs into my loft bed. Guess I'm cleaning that too now. So I'm like, which one? Another thumbs up. Okay, he either didn't get what I was trying to tell him, or he can't read. Eventually, my lizard brain took a breather from panicking long enough for the logic part of my brain to take over, and I went to where his clothes were and pointed at them, then at the door. He got dressed and left. Simple, done, and over. I shake for about 2 hours, drink a 6-pack, and post what happened to Facebook. In that time, it dawns on me that I probably just got staked for theft. So I spent another hour double and triple checking my security camera, which I originally got to check on the puppy I was training at the time for later. The next day he was on the stairs again, but made it very clear with head shakes and a roundabout trip back up the stairs and back up the other flight of stairs to go down the other set of stairs on the building that I wasn't going to help him again or be his buddy. 2 days after that, he was there again. I told the landlady, and she had him removed, and I never saw him again. And before you ask, nothing was stolen. I moved to the exact opposite end of the city 4 months later, and hope to never meet this guy again. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a 45-mile, 3-night kayaking trip down the Green River in Kentucky, which runs above the Mammoth Cave System, the world's longest known cave system, with more than 400 miles of surveyed passageways. We brought everything we needed in our kayaks and one canoe: food, tents, water filtration, etc., and camped each night on the riverbank when it started getting dark and we found level enough ground. The first night was uneventful, except to say that there is nothing like a wall of fireflies against a mountainous black tree line at night in the middle of nowhere. The second day, around sunset, after a long day of kayaking and baking in the July heat, we came upon a stream in the bank that opened up into a large ravine. The stream's, as we found out, was a cave spring pouring out blue, freezing cold water into a lagoon about 30 feet wide, and so deep the blue water turned black after a few feet. The lagoon had a long sandy beach, secluded by hills on either side and a tall overhanging cliff behind and above us. It was a beautiful, otherworldly place. Time moved very slowly there. We decided to camp there for the night. The sand was soft, white, and very fine, ideal for ground sleeping. For some reason, the place deeply frightened me, but I didn't speak up. We were all tired, and everyone was having fun. We built a small fire and enjoyed the stars through the canopy of leaves for a while before everyone went to bed. I slept hard that night. At around 5 a.m. I woke up with a huge urge to relieve myself. It was still dark. I had the tent door zipper about halfway open, and I had just popped my head out when I heard a loud and terrible roar/scream. I immediately cowered back into the tent and zipped it closed, and I waited. The scream came from about 10 feet to the left, near the dwindling fire. It was high-pitched, but not like an owl's screech, though I'm not ruling that out. It was a wretched, pained scream that got lower-pitched at the end. Being that we were in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, most likely it was a fox or boar or some kind of bird. Whatever it was, I lay awake for an hour, listening. I heard absolutely nothing. Granted, we were on a soft beach, but I didn't hear a single twig snap or leaf crinkle when whatever it was finally shuffled away. It was bizarre. I should mention at this time that up the beach and off to the side of the lagoon was a small dry cave opening maybe 3 feet wide. I cannot say with any certainty that it was not some ancient cave-dwelling creature that surfaced to investigate our camp. I somehow fell back asleep and awoke the next morning shaken. I asked if any of my friends heard the terrible scream, but no one had, and we pressed on down the Green River. The third night at dusk, we came upon a large, rocky beach. We pulled our boats ashore and decided this would have to do, as we didn't want to go further down the river and risk being stuck on the water at dark. This rocky beach was where the river split in two, and in the middle formed a collection of pale rocks, tall grass and dried out wood. a desolate pile of muck the size of a football field. A landmass was covered in jumping sand spiders and tiny frogs. Again, otherworldly. We set up camp, ate, and all went to bed around the same time. It was silent for 20 to 30 minutes. I'm not sure. I was asleep, as the others were most likely as well. Suddenly my dream was interrupted by what sounded like a booming loud mechanical wooden beast. I awoke and shot straight up. It was truly the loudest thing I've ever heard. It sounded like a massive bulldozer tearing down a huge steel and wooden building. And then came a boom, followed by its echo throughout the river valley. The animals shifted, and the birds flew away. We were all awoken by the crash and yelling in confusion at each other in our tents. Nothing but silence followed outside our tents, and no one was particularly willing to shine a flashlight towards the woods. Eventually, we all decided it was just a falling tree, and went back to sleep. The next morning I thought about it a bit more. It didn't sound like just a tree falling. I must stress it had a metallic quality, and it was projected purposefully. It almost sounded like a roar. In the morning light, we found no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, nor any obviously fallen trees that could have made such a loud sound. So we packed up and headed out onto the river one last time to head home. My friends and I talk about that trip and all the weird things that happened. We did the same kayak trip a few years later, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. No mysterious forest noises, to both my disappointment and relief. My friend June and I were 15 when we used to hang out all summer, riding her quad down to the river by ourselves. Her father didn't really care how long we were gone, so long as we were safe. But he worked nights as a prison guard in a different city, so he wouldn't really know if we were either way. Well, usually, things went fine. We stayed on the quad, messed around like teenagers do, got in the water, and went home. We almost always brought June's dog, Bo, and he was always useful to keep creeps away due to his size, as he was a bloodhound. However, one day we stayed later than usual, and it was getting pretty dark. We'd stayed late before, but we didn't like to do it often, so we packed up and left. When we got all the way home, put Bo in the house, locked up the quad, and realised that June didn't have her cell phone on her. Determined to not get in serious trouble with her dad in the morning when he found out she'd lost her phone, we decided to go back for it. Unfortunately, the quad was now low on gas, though we did have 2 spare bicycles. At first, we were only panicked because June's phone was missing. That was a pretty big deal by itself, but our unease grew as we rode past 2 vehicles that hadn't been on the path to the river before. The trucks were parked next to each other, and as we went by, the men exchanged some sort of goods. One of the men stuck something down his pants, and I was pretty sure I'd seen my first drug deal, and I'd always been taught I'd die for that. I didn't though, obviously. June waved at the men, which I remember cringing indirectly at. I don't know why I thought it was a bad idea, but I strongly believed that it would get us into trouble. We made our way to the area where we'd been sitting, searched for a few places we thought it could be, and eventually found the small silver device. It was on some rocks, and thankfully unharmed, though from its position, it must have fallen off the quad. We tried to go around where we knew the vehicles to be going through the bush, since we knew the area well, and we were both extremely uneasy. There was a rustle in the bushes to our right, and we both froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, as I made almost direct eye contact with something. Its eyes were glowing. I let all my air out at once. It was just a deer. It ran towards us despite knowing what it was now, and we screamed a little. We gave up on going around. It was too dark, and the nature would always be one step ahead of us. This was in early high school, and we didn't have flashlights on our phones to see. To our dismay, on our way back to the original path, the vehicles were still there, or at least one of them was. And it still creeped me out to talk about the situation. I was sure something bad was going to happen to us. I remember seeing headlights pointing at us as we rode our bikes to the right as quickly as we could. But I was always the weaker of the two of us and was falling behind. June was yelling at me to hurry up, and I'm pretty sure I began crying at this point. I was so sure that if they got to one of us, it would be me. We got ahead of them enough to reach a slight curvature in the blackberry bush that separated this part of the path from the main one. June grabbed my hand to pull me down the bushes, and the thorns scraped against my exposed skin. I always wore shorts with my bikinis, but the rest of me was still open to the weapons of the bushes. It was worth it though, because they couldn't see us, and we could hear them. They idled in their car nearby, got out, and looked around a little. "Where'd they go? You see where they went?" "I thought they went that way." They got back in their car. Eventually the headlights faded further, closer to the river, and further from our way home. So we bolted, grabbed our bikes, and pedaled as fast as our little legs could take us. We pedaled so hard and hoped that we wouldn't be followed home. We made it safely. We locked the gate to the yard and went inside and watched the road for a while. Nobody went by. We went to the river the next day, and it was normal. There was something different, though, about the blackberries that we'd been hiding in. They'd been crushed, run over multiple times by cars until they were almost completely flat. I don't like to think about what would have happened if we'd have stayed in our oh-so-perfect hiding spot any longer. This happened about 4 years ago, spanning from the end of my grade 10 year to halfway through my grade 11. I was in the band room of my school, where my friends and I liked to hang out and eat our lunches, since we were all friends with the band teacher. But one day there was a few new people there. One of them was Tim. Tim was in grade 12. I was in grade 10. And we hit it off immediately. It was like we were almost the same person. Interests, hobbies, activities. I didn't see it at the time, but he was basing all of his likes off of mine. We exchanged information like Snapchat, Discord, phone number, the whole lot, and we spent a lot of time talking. This is where things started to go downhill. I was talking to him, and at this point we had known each other for about a week. He says to me that he's in hospital for attempting to end it all, and that he's really sorry. As soon as I saw this, I started crying, as I and other people we knew did actually have depression and similar thoughts. While he was in hospital for the week and a half he was there, he kept trying to get me to come see him, using the classic, "I'll finish it all if you don't come see me." I, however, could not want to go, as the mental health unit where I live has a strict family-only policy for the patient's safety. I explicitly told him that I could not see him, and he kept trying to manipulate me into doing so. A few weeks later, just after school ended, and Tim and I had begun talking for a while, I get a message from this girl called Sarah in my Instagram DMs, saying things like, "How dare you flirt with my boyfriend? Why did you come onto him when he has a girlfriend?" Things like that. I don't remember exactly, as I wanted to block this whole period of time out. After a while of explaining and telling her, I didn't know he had a girlfriend. She explains to me that he's done this thing before, and to just stop talking to him. Also, that he did the same thing to her initially, and now she's so far trapped in an abusive relationship, she can't get out. His MO per se was preying on young naive girls for mental validation, all while making them feel horrible for not doing things for him. Before Sarah coming to me, there were red flags and sirens going off in my head, but I chose to ignore them, since I didn't and still don't like breaking things off with people without good reason. When he invited me out, I'd make an excuse since my gut told me to run, but I didn't run. At least not before Sarah. After the explanation, I quickly started ghosting Tim. It was pretty simple since we didn't actually have any overlapping activities or hobbies, so all I had to do was block him on social media and block his number. Fast forward to the end of November of my grade 11 year. I've forgotten about Tim and tried my hardest to push what he did out of my brain. Guess who pops up on the only social media DM I forgot to block him on? But Tim. And me being the trusting person I was, saw nothing wrong with it. Perhaps he'd changed. Maybe he was a different boy now. He told me he was off for Christmas break the week after, and wondered if I wanted to go to a frat party with him. Now the flags are rising, and I say, sure, why not? Then text Sarah about what's happening. During this hiatus from Tim, Sarah and I built quite a close friendship. She says that she didn't even know he was coming back, and that he told her he was going to Cancun with his family for the holiday season, leaving on December 5th. But that she's away at her father's place about 45 minutes out of town for the week of the party, and to do as I see fit. I wanted to have some fun, so I went. I was easily the youngest person there, as I was only 16, and didn't feel comfortable drinking at a place other than my own home, so I chose not to. Tim, however, does drink. Once he was drunk enough for his liking, we get up to go, and I know where I live pretty well. It's not a big city, but not a small one either, and we went down a street I'd never been down before. There were red flags going off, and I was tense and jumpy. There's no one on the streets and no lights on in any houses. Tim then plants himself in front of me and tries to kiss me. Me being 16 and never having kissed anyone before didn't take this well. Luckily for me at the time, my mother was making me take a lady self-defense course, so I punch him in the eye, kick him in the groin, and book it. Some people might say that this was an overreaction, but I had been harassed before in a similar fashion and didn't want to take my chances with a drunk guy, even someone I knew. I bus it home from downtown, and when I get home it's a little after 10:30. I didn't tell my mum, since I was scared she'd be mad at me for being at a party. I was irrational, and in hindsight, probably should have told her. I immediately text Sarah, tell her what happened, and she doesn't reply until the following morning. From what she said, he'd texted her all sweet-like, and she'd given him the address of her dad's place, where she was staying while he was on a business trip. He got there still drunk and pissed off, hit her a few times and verbally abused her until she had to leave and go to her mother's house. I tell Sarah that I'm sorry for what's happened and hope it never happens again, but that I cannot keep talking to her unless I want Tim out my life, which I didn't. Back to today, and Sarah is still with Tim, and I see her around sometimes with a black eye one day or a swollen cheek the next. To this day I have trust issues with guys, and it's extremely hard for me to form romantic relationships for fear that this will happen again. Before cutting off contact with Sarah, I did offer help, and she said that other friends had too, but that she didn't want people tied up in her mess. I still say hi every once in a while, maybe once a year just to catch up. But that's it. To the boy who mentally abused me and abuses his own girlfriend, let's never meet again. I was with a group of 7 to 8 guys who rented a cabin for the weekend for a bachelor party. The same group of guys get a cabin once a year for a bro weekend. We had hoped to get the same spot we normally book, but it was unavailable. So the best man ended up booking a place that we'd never been to before, in a very remote part of the state. The place itself was cool, built in 1780 or 1790 on a big creek, and very remote. Now I'm a skeptic, but the guy who is getting married is not, and has had several experiences that has made him a believer. As soon as we walk in, the groom-to-be, Tom, says, "This place is haunted. I can feel it." I don't buy it, thinking that he's just saying it because the place was old. It was fascinating to think about the history there, though. It was in the middle of nowhere now. The people who lived there 200 years ago would have been completely removed from civilization. The first night, we all stayed up late partying into the morning. Tom, who was an offensive lineman in college, wakes me up by jumping on my bed and squashing me. We were supposed to go out that night to a nearby college town, but just ended up staying there. I was a little bored doing the same thing 2 nights in a row, and still tired from raging last night, so I ended up going to bed before anyone else at around midnight. I've of course heard about sleep paralysis, but never experienced it before, so I was terrified when I woke up for seemingly no reason, and couldn't move at all. Almost immediately, I see a shadow in the doorway. I think that it's Tom and the best man, who are trying to wake me up so I can rejoin the party. The shadow starts to move towards me. I think it's Tom, and that he's going to jump on the bed to squash me again. I try to yell out for him not to do that, but there's something wrong. I can't move, and I can't make a sound. Suddenly I realize that it's not Tom approaching my bed, but what I can only describe as a black shadowy mass. It did not have a human shape, but was about the same height and width as a human. It's moving fast, and when it gets to the edge of my bed, it jumps, like it's going to land on me and squash me, like I was worried that my friend was gonna do. When it gets over to me, it dissipates, spreads out, and vanishes in an instant. I can move again. I sit up and wonder what the hell just happened. I call out to my friends and there is silence. I look out the window and see that they are all outside there, still partying around the campfire. I get up, drink some water, and peek at my phone. It's 2 a.m. I look in the others' rooms, and they are indeed outside. It was maybe 10 seconds from the time I woke up, unable to move, to the time when the shadow or black mass disappeared. I was a little shaken up, felt some adrenaline for sure, but wrote it off as a bad dream, and fell back asleep after 15 minutes or so. But when I awoke again, I immediately began to think about it, how weird it felt being unable to move, and what I saw. Months later, it's still on my mind, and that's why I decided to share this. My story freaked some of the bros out, but everyone loved this cabin so much more than the one we usually stayed at, that we're very likely to be going back there this fall. So perhaps I'll have more to share then, but I don't think I'd like to stay in that same room though.